Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emma Hopler, and I am a rising junior at the Elliott School with the privilege of serving as this year's chair of the International Affairs Society. The IAS is an Elliott School organization dedicated to promoting the teaching and understanding of international affairs to students, ultimately helping them better engage with the world. We are currently exploring new international topics and taking advantage of our unique location in the nation's capital to open up the world to our diverse student body. Last year, in light of the unprecedented call for reform to our justice system, the IAS felt a strong need to hold a discussion for how we, as aspiring international affairs professionals, can practice anti-racism in our work and our lives. We have held a discussion at the start of each semester featuring experienced panelists, and we are proud to once again hold a space for this vital conversation. Our panelists today have generously donated their time to speak to us in a personal capacity, and you will have the chance to ask them questions using the chat feature during the question and answer session of today's panel. Without further ado, let me introduce our speakers today. The first of which is Mr. Dwayne Wright. Mr. Dwayne Kwesi Wright is a visiting assistant professor of higher education administration at the George Washington University. His research and social activism seek to advance educational opportunity and equity for all students, particularly those historically oppressed and marginalized in the American society. He has completed research on the topics of critical race theory, sociocultural theory, and critical pedagogy. His areas of empirical research interests include access, diversity, and equity, policies for underserved populations in higher education, the use and influence of social science research in and on law, and undergraduate and professional multicultural Greek life, and critical race theory and critical pedagogy in post-secondary education. And he completed his award-winning dissertation on the influence of diversity and inclusion on the culture of learning and living in law schools, particularly for marginalized and minoritized law students. Furthermore, Dr. Wright is currently the national coordinator, my goodness, I apologize, coordinator for the Council of Legal Education Opportunities Legally Inspired Cohort Program. This is a program focused on increasing minoritized students' access to law school. Dwayne, thank you so very much for joining us today. All right, and our next speaker, pardon me, let me pull up my bios here. Our next speaker is Ms. Rebekah Dramé, and she is joining us. I apologize, my computer seems to be giving me issues here. It always picks this time. Pardon me. Our next speaker, Rebekah Dramé, is a Foreign Service Officer with the Department of State. She is currently serving in India as the Deputy Consular Chief and Visa Chief at the U.S. Consulate in Hyderabad. Prior to moving to India, Rebekah was part of the Bureau of Consular Affairs staffing and assignment team and served as an assessor on the Board of Examiners for the Foreign Service, selecting the next generation of Foreign Service officers and specialists. Her previous overseas diplomatic assignments include consular positions in Cabo Verde, Mali, Trinidad and Tobago, South Africa, and Denmark. She has also served as a public diplomacy officer in Manila and Baghdad. Prior to entering the Foreign Service, Rebekah was a Department of State intern in the CA's Office of Public and Congressional Affairs and a citizen service specialist for Thailand and South Korea in CA's Office for American Citizen Services. Before joining the Department of State, Rebekah worked for public relations at the Walt Disney Company and at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel Company. And when she isn't at work, she's a mom to her two boys, Jesse and Abraham, and she's an active member and volunteer at church and in the community and loves to read, run, and swim. Thank you both so very much for joining us today. We can't wait to get started. You two can take it away.
Thank you, Emma, for what was a wonderful introduction. We appreciate you, and we're very excited about what you and the society under your leadership has planned for us going into this academic year. I can say that I will speak one time for Rebekah and say that we both appreciate the invite and we're excited about the conversation moving forward. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our new students and to the members of our family here. And that's what you are now. You've been admitted, you've crossed that hurdle, you've been tested, and you've been approved. And now you're here with us to join within is a very important conversation. Anyone that woke up this morning in America saw the importance of foreign policy, right on our shores or in other aspects of our larger global community in Afghanistan. But you also saw, if you observed the Security Council meeting this morning, a Black woman as our representative for the United Nations speaking on behalf of our government. And right there, you have the aspects of the international policy mixing with a little bit of intersectionality to talk about racism in America. And that's the type of conversation, rather broad, that we would like to have here today. And I could not be more blessed, more privileged, more honored to share this conversation with such an established foreign policy expert as Rebekah. And Rebekah, I am sure that the students will benefit greatly from your insights, and I can't wait to engage with you. Before we get started, folks, what I thought might be helpful was just to share a few brief definitions, a few brief categories, and I want to end not by giving you a definition of anti-racism, but by challenging you to sort of come up with your own. I see that you've already started to engage each other with the chat. We have people from Chicago, from Tennessee, from New York. I don't know if that's upstate or downstate. I'm from Brooklyn, New York myself. Feel free to use the chat to engage there, engage with each other, engage with ourselves. You can ask questions within the chat. You can have a direct message to myself or a direct message to Emma. She's a student just like you. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of our conversation. So the title of this short presentation, just to get you started, is called Anti-Racism in International Affairs. And if you want these slides, please do send me an email. I'll send them to you. I'll let you know in advance. We're going to go a little supersonic through this so we can get to the conversation and hear from our illustrious guests. So let's just talk before we get to anti-racism. Well, what is race? Well, as a lawyer, I usually just start with the dictionary definition of terms, right? And I think this comes from Webster's dictionary. It gives us a few definitions: a group of people related by common descent or heredity. A population so related, you get that dictionary language. What does that mean? I don't know. A population so related. And you have some other more technical terms. The Webster's indicates that this one is no longer in use. Any traditional division of humankind belonging to the Caucasian, Mongoloid, or Negroid, categorized by supposedly universally physical characteristics. This was a part of the Webster's dictionary just as far as a decade ago. So we know that race is an arbitrary classification of modern human beings, especially forming some kind of combination of physical traits such as skin color, right? So we know what race is, but let's dive deeper into that. We know that race is a method of classifying people, right? We know that race is a political and a social construct. And to my graduate students, you might have a little bit more familiar for what that is. But for my undergrad students, that means that when we look at politics, that created race, and we look at sociology, that also created the categories we know as race. Race is an important part of American culture. And because American culture is undoubtedly an important part of global culture, race has become an important part of global culture as well, even though race does not take on the same meaning in every context. Some of you are here to study South American affairs, and you'll know race in Brazil is not the same as race in America. Some of you are here to study Asian affairs, and I undoubtedly let you know that the ethnic and semi-racial differences in China are nowhere the same as they are in America, right? Race is usually defined by the majority. So to be Black in America is to be not white. It may help to go a little deeper and ask what race is not. Well, race is not real. I know some of you say that and say, well, okay, Dr. Wright, I've got you. Race is not real. Colorblindness. Let's just forget, let's stop doing it. By saying race is not real, I do not mean that race is equivalent to the genie in Aladdin. All I mean is that there is no biological category known as race. We created it, we keep using it. Also, we know that race is not permanent. Who has been considered white in America has changed over the years. The Irish and the Italians prior to World War II were not considered white. We see the evolving status of Latina, Latino, or Latinx communities in America as well, and the expansion of whiteness. And if you have any questions about that, hopefully this is perking it up there. Maybe most important to the incoming Elliott students and the sort of atmosphere and audience that we're talking to today, race is significantly different than ethnicity and nationality. Nationality is the country of which you are a citizen. So I am an American citizen. Ethnicity refers to particular groups of a common ancestry, traditions, language, or dialect. My ethnicity, as someone born in the Caribbean country of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, is Caribbean, even though my race may be Black or African American. However, my nationality remains American. Complex, I know. We'll get into it, and I'm sure Rebekah has tons of war stories that she can tell you about defining these terms. But it's really important for you at the onset to realize that these are three distinct categories. And we get into problems collapsing ethnicity, race, and nationality into one category. So finally, what is racism? Well, let's go to the dictionary definition. They say racism is a belief that the primary determinant of human traits and capacities and the racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. A belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities and that racial differences alone produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. You have a secondary definition that says a doctorate or a political, there goes that word again, program based on the assumption of racism's designed to execute its principles, all right? It's important to understand that here at Elliott, in particular, here at GW and NTC, for anyone that's coming to join us in person, there are a mildred of different views. And we don't try to advance any one view. We're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to teach you how to think critically. And there are several different perspectives on racism that I think we'll have in the world. First, there's a colorblind perspective, right? Race should never matter to a decision maker, and it's never necessary to increase racial equality. One Chief Justice of the United States once said about a decade ago, the way to stop racial discrimination is just stop discriminating based on race. Colorblind, one perspective. Another perspective, maybe the middle perspective, is a sort of race-neutral perspective. The consideration of race is not necessary. Other characteristics may produce as much. Many of you are coming in to study economic policy. And there's a very famous economic policy, call it Marxism, call it communism, neo-Marxism, socialism, whatever you wish, that has the primary of class and takes race as just an offshoot of class subordination. May be able to fit that one into the race-neutral perspective. And the readings of Michael Cole are really illustrious on that. And then you have the color conscious perspective, right? Well, the use of race is necessary if we are to address differences in racial inequality. And I just want to say, what you think of as racism may actually be determined by which of these perspectives you take. Now, of course, nothing's just black and white, right? So some might say I'm 75% in one, 10% in the other, or Dr. Wright, I'm 3-3-3, 33% for all these perspectives. That's fine. But in trying to understand anti-racism, it really depends on how you view racism. If you think that racism is just about choices on and based on race, we call this maybe the individual bad actor racism. This type of perspective maybe corresponds to the colorblind perspective, and you would say something like a policy, affirmative action, which is known as positive discrimination. In India or France or Brazil has adopted it. It's not just an American trait. That's racism because you're using race to determine advantages. You probably come on the colorblind perspective. But then there are other perspectives that says race equals any and all prejudice because of race. And then another perspective, a little bit more critical, that says racism equals prejudice and power. These different views of what racism is will then determine the different views of what anti-racism is. So finally, rather than give you a definition of anti-racism, I would like to encourage you to begin the conversation within the chat. What's your definition of anti-racism? Does it correspond to any of the three, which of course are not 100% continuous that we outlined here, or the different perspectives on what racism is? And now, Rebekah, with all that said, I would like to turn to you, and maybe we can start here. You've had a remarkable and illustrious career. Why don't you walk us through the career, tell us where you started and how you got to where you are today, And why don't you end your comments with giving us your own personal definition of anti-racism?
Great, thank you so much, Dwayne. I hope everybody can hear me. So actually, when I like to talk about my career, I like to start actually where I'm from. I know that you're an East Coast New Yorker, Dwayne, but I am born and bred in Los Angeles, California. So all my West Side for Life folks out there, I am one of you. So, and that is kind of where I would even say my career started. For those of you who know California, you know California is extremely diverse. And me being the kind of nerdy, always reading kind of young woman that I was, growing up where I grew up, which was a predominantly African-American neighborhood, by the time I got to middle school, it really wasn't safe anymore where I lived to go to school in my neighborhood. My mom went down to the district and decided that her daughter, her oldest daughter, I'm one of 5 kids, I'm the middle, would be bused to school. So I ended up going to school in a part of Los Angeles called Westchester. I took the bus about an hour and a half each way to get to and from middle school and high school. And that school was very, very different than the school that I grew up in. And so that was kind of my first time experiencing, number one, being away from a neighborhood where everyone was my same race, and being in a very different, diverse environment where I would be considered a minority. In the honors program that I was in, I was only one of 2 African Americans in that program. Pretty much, we had, I think, 3 Asian kids, and everybody else was white. Although there may have been a Latino person, as you mentioned earlier, Dwayne, possibly. But from at that point in time, the person considered themselves white. So that's where it all started for me. And then I went to undergrad in St. Louis, Washington University in St. Louis, awesome school. And throughout, I would say, especially high school and undergrad, I was always the one who was around the international kids. It's always been just something that I've been fascinated with, probably because I grew up kind of in the same town and then had these experiences. And so I've always had a love of all things international, which led me to study abroad my junior year. But instead of deciding to go to France or the UK, where most students were studying abroad, I chose to go to Kenya. And at that time in my life, I was in my very, very, I like to say, Afrocentric phase, was speaking Swahili and just very interested in learning more about Africa in particular. And so I went to Kenya for a year, studied abroad. I'll never forget arriving at the airport and the immigration officer telling me, welcome home. And just being like crying, like, welcome home, wow, am I gonna be accepted here? And that was my first true international experience ever. And then after that, went back, did some working, and eventually made my way to Washington for grad school, where I went to American University. And so when I think about my career, where it started, I often draw from really that experience being taken out of my comfort zone, so to speak, where I grew up, and being placed in these other environments that I was not used to. However, because of that, I learned very early, so we're talking middle school by age 12, how to switch from my neighborhood and how I was there to this whole other environment, which was where I was in the minority. So by the time I started my internship with the Department of State and eventually took the Foreign Service exam and all of that and joined the Foreign Service, I was very comfortable, if not happy, but very comfortable, used to this idea of living away from, or being a minority, to be honest, just being the only one. And so I have seen all 3 of your categories of race theory. I've seen colorblind. I've had many people throughout my life tell me, I'm colorblind. I don't see that you're Black, Rebekah. I've had people who say, well, you have to stand on your own merit and you're a great officer, so you're going to move up quickly because you're doing a great job. It doesn't matter what color you are. And then most recently, especially over the last 3 years of my career, I have been just thrilled to finally be able to be in a color consciousness environment where we in the Department of State, and again, I am speaking on my own personal capacity, have had some really tough but necessary conversations on race. And so you asked me kind of what I think racism is. I would say if there's only one thing you remember today from me, it would be that it starts with me. So it starts with you. So the conversation on racism to me is all about looking first personally, looking at yourself. And I can give you a quick example before I stop. And that is, I remember the first time I went to China and I get off the train because I had gone from Hong Kong to mainland China. And I remember being in the train station and seeing a Chinese man sweeping. He was a janitor. And it hit me. I had never seen a person of Asian descent in a blue collar janitorial job in my life, my whole life. And it really struck me. And I said to myself, and this was quite a long time ago, wow, Rebekah, look at you. You have all of these notions. You have all of these preconceived ideas about what people based on their race are supposed to do. So I say it starts with me because we all at some point, including myself, have either been the perpetrator of racism or the victim of racism. And the only way to make it stop is to truly look inside yourself and put yourself in check and just be self-aware and understand where your background and how that might manifest itself towards other people. And so I don't know if that answered your first question, but hopefully that gave you a general.
Oh, no, I think that was an excellent answer. And I've just got so many follow-ups coming, but I do want to remind our students, this is about you. So please feel free to engage in the chat. What questions do you have for myself? What questions do you have for Rebekah? You can put it in the chat. I think there's a Q&A function. You can send a direct message to myself, or if you don't want to, tell the professor what you're doing, you can send a direct message to Emma as well. She's here for you. So Rebekah, just a follow-up on that, and that was a wonderful answer. And like I said, I have popcorns going off, but I want to stay focused for a second on foreign policy. You have, like I said, had a remarkable career, definitely stood up on your own merit, whatever that meant, and an excellent foreign service officer. In your opinion, your personal opinion, how does anti-Black racism affect American foreign policy? And what racist, I should say, efforts should we be doing to sort of curb those effects if they exist? Any thoughts?
Sure. I do. I have a lot of thoughts on that. And a lot of it plays out in the news constantly in terms of, you can just look at things like military support. That's just one of the easiest ways to look at things. So you have right now Afghanistan dealing with a major international issue. At the same time, you have Haiti, who right now is in a trifecta of political turmoil, an earthquake, and weather on the way. And so you look at the headlines, and when you looked at the headlines today, what was there? What are the responses? I'm thrilled that Secretary Biden recently announced a special envoy for Haiti. There's been an envoy for Afghanistan and for South Asia and Southeast Asian conflicts and Middle East conflicts for a long time. But those are the kind of things that are just very easy to see. And it does make you wonder, wow, why is it that Haiti, considering all the things that have happened over the last decade even, is just getting a special envoy this year, and they've never had one before. So so things like that. Again, depending on the administration, aid towards Africa. I've served in every region of the State Department. Actually, coming to India now was the last region that I needed to serve in to serve in them all. And so when I look at aid and where USAID is and what the aid looks like, those are the other things. For example, I was in the Philippines, we had USAID, and then I was in Africa, many different parts of Africa where we had USAID. So our aid in Africa oftentimes focuses on things like maternal health, which is extremely necessary, sexual, reproductive health, a lot of programs on reproductive health, a lot less programs on things like democracy and governance. Whereas when I was in the Philippines and I was working in public affairs, pretty much every program we did with AID dealt with democracy, human rights, nothing regarding health. And that could be because the health situation is a lot better there. But at the same time, it made you take a moment to say, well, should African Post also have more emphasis on democracy building or human rights issues and things like that as well? Not saying that they don't exist. It's just when you look at the proportion of the aid and what is it used for, it is very different. And so those are things where, in my personal opinion, again, I'm not speaking for the Department of State, where race seemed to me be an issue. Again, I'm sure if we had an expert from the department who talked about the numbers and the metrics and this is how much we're spending and where we're spending, there would be a really great answer to why things played out that way. But it is just something that I have personally seen. One other thing I would be interested to share about race more from a personal standpoint, which is a foreign policy standpoint, because the protection of diplomats is extremely important. There's a convention called the Vienna Convention that states that foreign governments, when you have diplomats in those countries, are required to protect them. So from my own personal experience, having lived in many, many different places, I, unfortunately, and my family have had various incidents, including assaults in different countries. And it's based on race. And so how these are handled in different countries is something I also notice, and it is, in my opinion, a foreign policy issue. So for example, when I was in the Philippines, I had an amazing leader who handled it very, very well. However, when I was in Denmark and Europe, it wasn't handled very well. And so a lot of times how it was handled was directly related to how the mission or the embassy felt the incident would play out with the host government. So if we thought the host government would be helpful and sympathetic to it, then we could push them. But if we were worried about the host government being overly sensitive about it and not really ready to talk about it in a real way, then it was always downplayed, and at the expense of whom? The employee. And so some of you may have read last year some really just tragic articles written by a former Foreign Service colleague, Tiana Spears, who talked about her experience, not even just overseas, crossing it back into our own country with our immigration officials. And that and the way it was handled quite poorly. And so these are the kind of things which are also foreign policy issues on a more personal level, not necessarily the higher level, but they all show different aspects of racism and how they're handled.
No, that's remarkable. I'm just reflecting on a lot that you said. And first of all, sorry you had to go through that, right? Because we send people out there and you would hope that when you're representing your country, you have the full backing of your country, regardless of race. And the fact that that's clearly not the case, I think shows that we have a lot of work to do. I'm going to drop that article, or at least one of the series of articles by Tiana from Politico in the chat for our students to review on their own leisure. And this is just more testimony to back up what you're talking about. I'm going to remind our students, feel free to engage. Don't be shy. For those of you coming from undergrad, this is now grad school. Questions get the A's. For those of you now entering undergrad, this is post-secondary institutions. So, feel free to engage. If you have curiosities, please put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, send a direct message to myself or Emma, Rebecca. We will love to engage in your questions. I want to get a little bit more particular on foreign policy. And I want to ask the question this way. So the relationship between race relations in America and foreign policy goes all the way back. For those of you that may be readers of Derek Bell and, are interested in the hoopla right now going over critical race, one of Derek Bell's first sort of ideas was that the Brown versus Board of Ed desegregation case in America was not about race relations, but it was about foreign policy. And he said the Supreme Court at that time wanted to improve America's standing on the international stage vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And that's why Brown came about. We saw last year that protest around the unfortunate murders of George Floyd, bookended by the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and our sister Breonna Taylor, started in America, but spread globally, hitting countries as far south as Colombia and Brazil, of course, as far west as the UK and France, and even, Japan and other Asian countries got in on the mix. And even today, as critical race theory seems to be under attack by certain conservative political events in America, you see Boris Johnson's government and even the government of the French government commenting on that as well. Rebekah, you've been at the front lines for quite some time and through several different administrations, so we don't really have to have a political conversation here. In your opinion, how does American race relations impact American foreign policy? Is it direct? Is it indirect? How does that actually work from your perspective?
Wow, so that's kind of a hard question, but I'll do my best. I personally think that US race relations and US foreign policy for a long time were separated. So what was happening here and what was being fought for here, people didn't seem to feel it as much as overseas. So here's an example. If you have a persecuted group overseas, like any group, the LGBT community in certain parts of Africa, for example, if you have that persecution going on overseas, the full might of the State Department will go and speak out, and the ambassador will démarche, which means we'll make a formal discussion to the host government about it. We'll have our international human rights report. We'll write it inside there and say, this group of people are being marginalized or discriminated against, and we will put the full weight of the US government. But the same exact thing can be happening here, and it gets no traction whatsoever. So you have that kind of issue. I think what happened last summer with George Floyd was unique. And it was unique for the same reason the civil rights movement was unique in the 60s. It was because you had video. And so, again, it's been a long time since I've been in school, so sorry, but I do remember how the media transformed the civil rights movement. And I think that is what has made a huge translation, made it easier to translate. No words are required. A video speaks in every language. And so I think that's where suddenly the United States had a reckoning. And in fact, other governments started pointing it out when the tragic January 6th attack on the Capitol happened earlier this year. Oh my goodness, other countries, if you saw the messages I had from friends, foreign friends, just like, oh, how will the US be able to say all the things that we want to say when we see this happening in our own shores? So I do think more recently, in my opinion, there's been more of a connection, but to be honest, not always. On the other hand, you can take a place like South Africa, where I lived for 3 years and had my favorite post of all time that I got to serve in, where during apartheid, the US government pretty much turned its back. We had sanctions. We pretty much ignored everything going on there, even though we could have learned from our own mistakes. We had just endured the same thing 30 years before, but we kind of ignored it. So I think when it's convenient, or when it's just suddenly the government has no choice, then it does kind of bleed into the US race relations, bleeds into outside, into US foreign policy. However, I just think oftentimes the two are very separated. And that also is because of the American people, let's be honest. Most Americans are not interested in what's going on unless they're living on a border, the southern border, they may care a little bit more, but if they haven't traveled very much, and they're not really interested. And so they are kind of almost easy to keep separate there. And that said, I mean, one of the positive things about working overseas is you do become you're all Americans. So, once you're in the embassy, to the outside, you're supposed to all be Americans. There are going to be exceptions on how you're treated locally, but in general, you are all Americans there. And so it does become kind of like a little, ideal world, fantasy world inside the embassy where all of a sudden everybody just gets along. It's not perfect, but it does seem a lot less like the US sometimes when you're actually in the American embassy working environment.
No, yeah, I remember I woke up this morning and I have two feeds as someone born not here. My international feed was all about Afghanistan, and my domestic feed is still concentrating on Britney Spears conservatorship. Nothing against Britney Spears. I'm a lawyer, so that's actually has intellectual property correspondence, but it just shows what the world focuses on for what we focus on can tend to be two different things. I want to shout out my sister, Rachel Rose, who put a question in there. Thank you for starting us off, Rachel. And I will say, I'm going to try to sneak one more question in. I could talk to you, Rebekah, for literally hours, but I do want to turn to our students. And if the rest of our students could follow Rachel's lead and put your questions in the chat, direct message myself, direct message Emma. As soon as this last question, we're going to turn to you in just 1 second. And thank you, Rachel, for starting us off. So here's sort of the last question for me, Rebekah, and it's sort of a complicated one, but I'm going to try to simplify it as much as possible. I tend not to say taking race out of it because I don't think that's possible, right? But we have students here that have all types of identities. We have students that might be women and are nervous about going into countries that don't have the protections for women that America has. We have students that might be part of the LGBT community, whether they're out or not out, and know that they're going to countries where that is still punishable by death. And we have students at the intersection of both, whether they be LGBT women, Black women, etc. Having gone through school, going through all your practice and served everywhere in the country, I don't want to put a number on it, but if I had to, maybe two things you really wish you knew were back then where our students are right now. So our students are, some are starting graduate school, master's programs, starting undergraduate programs. Two things that you're like, if I just knew these two things, the journey up would have been easier. And that might be complicated because it might be a million, but if you could just help me out by narrowing it down to the two most important things, I'd really appreciate it.
That's awesome. Well, I actually do have two things I can offer, and neither advice is mine, but I've been very fortunate to have great mentors and just folks who've pulled me up along the way, including one person, Chris, on this call, who is why I'm invited here today. And so I would say the first thing I would like to say, and this is something I tell my boys all the time, the job, your dream job, whatever it is, most likely doesn't exist. I wish someone had told me that. Even in the foreign service that I want doesn't exist quite yet. It starts with me. It's up to me to make it happen. But even other, like anything, I think if you had asked me 10 years ago, would I be in a conversation with, a doctor of critical race theory, would you say that existed? Probably not. And so that would be the first thing I wish I had known, because then I would have probably taken more risks and probably spoken up more in that regard, and looked for things that rather than trying to fit myself into something else, trying to fit the things around me into me, like making, and I'm doing a lot better at that now. But it was when you're young and when you're starting out, you're just trying to like, oh, I'm just gonna take that foreign service exam and get the foreign service and be like a little cookie cutter foreign service officer like everyone else. No, don't want that. Want to create something that is so new and amazing and that will to continue to lift up our nation and lift up one another that doesn't exist yet. I wish someone had told me that. And then the second thing, a really funny one I learned was, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. And oftentimes, your ego, at least I sometimes have a pretty big ego, makes you want to be that one. Oh, you want everyone to ask you questions and all of those things. But really, if you want to keep learning and building, surround yourself with smart people, surround yourself with people who are not like you, be open to make not just a superficial friendships and superficial acquaintances, but really taking time. The magic words and the foreign services, would you like to grab a cup of coffee? Do you want to have a tea? Take the time. If we've learned anything from the pandemic, it's life is short. And if you meet someone interesting and you want to get to know more, have that cup of tea, have a chai with that person. And just remember to surround yourself with as many other smart people and people just not like you as you possibly can. It will only make you a better person, in my opinion. Those are my two pieces of advice.
No, I think that's wonderful advice. And now let's turn to the main event, and that's for our incoming students, the incoming members of our GW family, our future alumni. And that's what you are, your future alumni. If you got admitted, you can make it and you will. The first question comes from Rachel Rose, and I think I know the answer to this one, but I'll give it to you, Rebekah, anyway. Does the State Department or the US government as a whole have their own definition of anti-racism apart from the dictionary definition? And I will remind our incoming students that Rebekah and I are talking in our personal capacities, not as representative of our separate organizations. But Rebekah, do you know of a sort of State Department definition of anti-racism yet?
No, I don't. I do know I'm really proud of the department. For the first time in our history, we just recently got a Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, and I would really encourage you to invite her to come and give all the official department work that's been going on related to this issue. I can say that in my experience, we define anti-racism as anti-discrimination, to be honest. It's that we do not discriminate against anyone based on the color of their skin, their nationality, all the protected bases under EEO. And that's pretty much what I would say any State Department person would tell you is kind of our definition.
No, and yeah, we definitely get together with Kylie and see if we can get the CDO of the State Department here coming up this year or in the future. And if our students have likely any other suggestions of people you would like to hear from, I know Kylie's office and really everyone in the leadership at Elliott would love to get those suggestions as well. Daniel Price, who I saw earlier was from Tennessee, has a series of questions, and I'll give them all to you at once, Rebekah. Would you say having a Black president affected the treatment of Black service officers abroad and at home? And the follow-up to that is, how did Obama's presidency affect the views and attitudes of other nations toward African Americans in positions of power in our own government?
That's a great question. And the answer is a resounding yes, it made a difference, a huge difference. For me personally, when Obama was elected, I was in Trinidad. And so I served in Trinidad, and then I served in Iraq, and then I served in South Africa during, and then when the first part of Denmark, I was there. So yes, one of the biggest things was oftentimes when I'm overseas, especially just anywhere, to be honest, the one other of African origin group who is there's two other groups of African origin who are mostly overseas that in other parts of the world. It's either people from Nigeria or people from Somalia, Ethiopia, kind of the Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, the Horn of Africa region. Oftentimes, throughout my whole career, people automatically ask, oh, are you from Nigeria? are you Somali? Are you Ethiopian? Almost always, no matter what. So Obama comes on the scene. And so people still ask me, are you Nigerian? Are you Ethiopian? Are you Somali? But I'll say, oh, I'm American. And then they'll be like, oh, like Obama, you know, because it was like suddenly it was like, oh, yes. You know, before Obama, it was Michael Jordan. In general, I think Obama, because he was an athlete, he was a president, it made a tremendous difference in just the recognition that African Americans are also in the foreign service, or that just in politics and in around the world. I think oftentimes I've been the only African American in my embassy, quite often. Very rarely am I not. And so you do feel this weight to carry the water for the race, even though your perspective is unique, like mine is very unique. So oftentimes, because of Obama and because it allowed us to celebrate the first Black president, we could have all these conversations about being African American. Suddenly, it was just, oh, we can try out, you know, our African American staff and go into speeches. And these were things I was doing before Obama was elected, but I think everyone realized how important it was, how much more important it was, at least in my opinion, to do that. So I think that was, so yes, definitely helped many non-Americans see that African Americans exist and that we are smart and very capable, and that you can win through multiracial efforts. You didn't need to only have the Black people vote for you to get to be something, that actually other races can have confidence in Black people. That was a big part of it, because to win, he even if every Black person in America voted for him, he would not have won. So it was just nice to make those kind of connections. And then let's see, how did Obama affect our national policy? To be honest, very similar to his predecessors, to be honest. Aside from the previous administration, most US foreign policy pretty much did the exact same thing. And even the previous administration did almost the exact same thing. Very little changes dramatically. And that makes sense. You have to be very prudent when you're dealing with US foreign policy, because when you do something very big, it's going to make a big impact and it's going to be in the news. And so you have to make sure you're ready for whatever the fallout, if there is fallout, or the praise, if there's praise from those decisions. And so I didn't necessarily feel personally that the Obama administration was terribly different than the previous administrations. Especially, I'm a consular officer, which means I've spent majority of my career dealing with immigration issues, dealing with crisis management, protecting US citizens, more very grassroots, dealing with people. And so the biggest changes to immigration started under the Obama administration, where that was where we had our first kind of, it wasn't called a travel ban at that time exactly, but it was where we started having more criteria from people from certain countries. And that started before the last administration. And it was a huge difference for us. So the two big differences was 9/11. I started right after 9/11. And so I saw the changes in our US foreign policy during the Bush administration. And then during the very last year of the Obama administration was when we started all the travel restrictions and things like that. And then the next administration took it to a whole nother level. So honestly, most the US foreign policy changes by president are not usually huge. If they're smart, they'll listen to the people who actually work on the ground and they'll tell you what works. And oftentimes that's what we're already doing. So they tend to keep it.
So I've got 3 more questions and I've got under 5 minutes. So here's what I'm going to try to do, since they're all important. I'm going to give you this one, then I'm going to try to combine the last 2, and then we'll go straight to closing remarks after that, and we'll go back to Emma. I know this is scheduled to be done at 3:15, and I want to respect your time, but we did start a little late, so I'll try to see if I can get all 3 of my students in. Now, the next question is from Jillian. It's, how is working abroad how has working abroad, changed your opinion on our own government? Has you lost or gained respect based on your experiences?
Okay, great. So I've always been about service. And so I got into this. And if anybody is interested in joining the Foreign Service, I really hope you do some self-reflection. I did not get into this for grandeur. I got into this to serve. I come from a family of a lot of military in my family, and I wanted to serve, but without a gun. I wanted to serve with words and smile and reasoning. So, so my perspective regarding service has not changed, not one bit. I'm here today, it's 12:30 a.m. here in Hyderabad, India, because I want to serve. I just want to serve our country. I love America. I love doing what's right for this country, but I firmly believe 100% what I said at the beginning, what I don't want you to forget, that it starts with me. If I don't work on it, I can't expect Dwayne to work on it or Emma to work on it. I have to, it starts here. And so is the government, does it still need work? Yes. Have we come a long way? Yeah, we have actually. We have achieved diversity, equity, inclusion. That's huge for us. I worked on the Board of Examiners for the Foreign Service, and I worked on a lot of really important things to promote inclusivity that I feel so proud of. I would never have been able to do those things if I wasn't in the room. From Hamilton, I was in the room where it happened, and so I was able to make the difference. If I was outside of that room, I can't make that difference. So yes, do I feel like we've made gains? Yes. Do I feel like there's more work to do? Absolutely. And I am here to do it. And I'm going to do it as long as they let me do it, as long as I'm here. Even after I retire, like Thomas Greenfield, who's a role model of mine, I will come back and do it some more if that's what they ask me to do. But that's why I'm here. So hopefully that answers.
Oh, no, you definitely did. And thank you for your service. We really appreciate it. And of course, thank you for your time. So now I've got two questions that I'll combine. One from Centauro, hope I pronounced that right. I think out of Vienna, Virginia, if I remember, and another from Blake Franklin. And the two questions combined, which might have a couple of parts, are this. What kinds of actions can I take as a young student to make racist people aware of anti-racism/anti-discrimination? I would be grateful if I can hear the thoughts of two professionals. And the other question from Blake Franklin goes as follows. Thoughts on identity politics, and in parentheses, he has Candace Owens there, and the fact that the most watched news show, Tucker Carlson, is claiming to be colorblind, yet is outwardly fearful of the increase in diversity of the 2022 census. How can we stop the fear-mongering about diversity in America? So one about identity politics and fear-mongering, and one questions about what actions young students could take to make supposedly racist people aware of anti-racism and discrimination. Rebekah, any thoughts?
Sure. I would just say it's an education. So I think what you're doing right now is a perfect example of what we all need to be doing, is taking time to learn. One of the things that I found out the hard way with in the Department of State is that I'm expecting people to know what to do in terms of fighting racism. So oftentimes we, as an African American, it's so obvious to me that it's racist. It's so obviously wrong. But then I'm looking in the face of my colleague and they honestly have zero clue. I'm not saying that about Tucker Carlson, don't get me wrong. But there are people who honestly are clueless. I'm not saying everyone. And so it does become, again, for me, it becomes an opportunity, a teaching moment. I have a lot of teaching moments, and I have had a lot in my career, and I'm okay with it. I'm okay because often I'm the only one, and most likely it only offends me. So if I don't say anything, then who is going to say it on my behalf? So on the one hand, it's one person at a time, one step at a time. So that's kind of, as students, when you hear it, whether the person hears it or not, or especially when no one's around. I think that is the real one to me that I see oftentimes in the professional world, is when you hear the racism or you hear the fear mongering, even when nobody from that race is around, that's when you need to speak up. Because if you only do it in front of, when you know someone else is listening, it's not going to help that much. But when you call somebody out on that, when nobody else is around, and you stand up for people who you don't even realize who you're standing up for, that to me is very impactful. So on the one hand, it starts there, and also sharing your stories. I used to not talk about being the victim of racial violence, assaults. I never talked about it for a really long time because I thought it would make people uncomfortable. But over the last 3 years, by sharing that, it allowed us to have a class for leaders in the State Department on how to handle it, because that was one of my biggest issues. It wasn't that I was going to get justice. It was just the way leaders handled it so differently. I never knew what was going to happen. How was it going to be resolved? And so oftentimes the leaders just didn't know what to do because no one talked about it. And so I would just say, making racist, you can't change another person, but you can influence them perhaps by speaking up, especially when no one's around. And again, also being self-aware, checking on with yourself, and then sharing stories of the good, the bad, and ugly regarding racism, and especially the good. This is a good. So definitely share it, because you're taking time to learn and to know and to become more self-aware and look for ways to be an advocate and an ally. Like, all of those things starts with you within. And so that would be really the advice. And then again, with Tucker Carlson, if you have time, send letters to NBC, to Fox. Sorry, send letters to Fox. Send a lot. They don't like those. They might like it because it means that people are watching, but send letters, go on. I don't want to say troll, but go on and say you're absolutely incorrect. This is wrong. Here's facts, like things like that. Call people out on it. I can't do that as a federal government employee. I'm not allowed, but you can. So go for it.
Yes, and I'll just follow up there. Sorry, there was an echo. And I'll say this, each and every person on this call, particularly the students that are now coming into the Elliott School at the George Washington University in DC, are privileged in some type of way. Now, we know structural racism exists, institutional racism exists, white privilege exists, but let's remember, folks, only 33% of Americans will ever make it into a college, ever. So just the fact that you're actually taking this on, you're privileged. Never be afraid to give up your privilege. If you are, a member of the LGBT community, and you're passing and you're in a conversation, speak up. If you are a white person and the friends around you are making racist jokes or saying things that are racist, speak up. Now that you have acquired this privilege, you can't just sit and skate through it. You've got to be willing to sacrifice it and actually go on. So I would say never be afraid to actually use your privilege, even if it's minuscule, in a situation to advance. With that said, Rebekah, any closing remarks, anything that if you were sitting as a student, you would want to know before I turn it back over to Emma to wrap it up? I must say, this has been a remarkable conversation. It's a privilege and an honor to have you. I'm so glad that you're serving us and you're serving our country. And, from the bottom of my heart, everyone here at GW and Elliott, we're amazingly proud of you. So with that said, any closing remarks from you, Rebekah?
No, thanks so much, Dwayne and Emma and Kylie and everyone and Chris at the Elliott School. It's just an honor. I've been your neighbor just the last 3 years. So it's just having a chance to meet you guys today and talk with you. It's been really an honor. And I'm going to drop in the chat the email address of our diplomat in residence, Yolanda Kearney, who covers Washington, D.C. And if you are interested in the Foreign Service and more information about race, or if you want to get connected more about with the Department of State, she's definitely a great resource for you. She's very active. Her auto reply alone will provide you so much guidance and wisdom if you're interested in a career with the Department of State. And so with that, I just want to remind you that it does start with you. So please take that responsibility to be your own ambassadors around you and to encourage others to stop racism.
No, thank you, Rebekah. And I know that everyone here at Elliott, and most importantly, our students, are greatly appreciative of your time, your efforts, your service for this country, and the remarkable wisdom passed on in this conversation. And now it's my privilege to turn it over to Emma to have a few announcements as we wrap it up. Emma, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That is our time for today, but your wisdom, both of you, your wisdom and your insight was so very appreciated today. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to speak to all of us. Also, just a special thanks to the Elliott School of International Affairs for continuing to support the IAS in hosting this event, and to the LEAP program for helping plan this and other programming for students. For those listeners who are interested in joining the International Affairs Society, you can continue to have access to panels such as this. We will be having an information session at the Elliott School Club Fair on September 9th from 3 to 6:30 p.m. But if you have any questions between then and now, I'll go ahead and drop my email in the chat as well. If you have any questions about student life here, I can answer those as well. Happy to help out. And finally, to close us off for the day, I'd like to introduce Mr. Paul Wagner. He oversees the Elliott School Student Service Portfolio, including academic advising, career development, international education, and student organizations. Mr. Walker, go ahead.
Thanks, Emma. And I just want to echo my gratitude to both Dwayne and Rebekah for facilitating and participating in this very important conversation. And huge thank you to IAS for co-sponsoring this and really sort of setting the tone in terms of our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice here at the Elliott School. I also want to thank our students because I recognize that you have not officially started yet, and the fact that you are participating in programs really demonstrates your commitment to really be a part of this very important conversation. And so thank you for being here. I just want to really quickly highlight a few resources, both at the Elliott School and more broadly at GW. And if you're a first-year student, you're going to take IFF 1001. You hear a lot about these, so this will just be a reminder when you hear that. Of course, we have our Elliott Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and so that is a important resource for all of you to know. Kylie Stam is our diversity program manager. She's a little under the weather today, so I'm actually talking at the end. Usually, it's Kylie giving the closing remarks, and we also have Ashley Cedino, our operation lead. And so we offer a number of programs and services throughout the year to all of our students, as well as our faculty and staff. And so we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter so that you're always up to date in terms of all the things that we're offering. We offer a diverse perspectives in international affairs series where we try to bring in speakers that certainly align with our cultural heritage celebration. And I think, as Dwayne mentioned, if you've got thoughts and ideas in terms of speakers, we would love to hear that because we're happy to bring them into our space. We also have our Council on Diversity and Inclusion, and we'll soon be announcing our class representatives for our undergrad and our grad students first years. And so once we do that, we encourage you to engage with our class representatives to really amplify the things that you are experiencing and that you hear about that really promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And if you're more broadly interested in finding ways to advance this work, I encourage you to reach out to Kylie. She can drop her email in the chat. Feel free to reach out to her and we'll find ways to certainly have you connect with our team. We also, of course, have our Central Office for Diversity, Equity, Community Engagement, which does a lot of programming and resources for our community. You'll hear more about that during orientation. And so certainly want to give a shout out to OECE as well as our Multicultural Student Services Office, are two resources that we really want to highlight and amplify. Again, really want to thank Dwayne and Rebekah for their time and expertise and passion today, and want to say welcome to our new students. Thank you for starting the academic year off with us. And I'm happy to say this, we actually look forward to seeing you in person starting classes relatively soon. So thanks everybody, and hopefully all is well.